On April 4th, 1944, the train took me to the ancient, charming, partly destroyed city of Brest. I rode on an old bus. It crossed the drawbridge over the canal, climbed, exhaust coughing, to a hill, and followed it westward to the familiar gatehouse of the 1st Submarine Flotilla base. I noticed several air balloons swaying over the bay in the light morning breeze. This was a new means of protecting the concrete shelters of the submarines from planes coming in to target them on a glancing flight. Leaving the bus, I found that all base administrative offices were closed. However, the duty officer led me to a room overlooking the bay where sunbathing was customary. When I entered its glass door, I was blinded by the bright sunlight. Seated at white garden tables were a dozen men in naval uniforms. Not knowing the senior officer by sight, I ran my eyes down the sleeves of those present, trying to determine their rank from the patches. One of the group of officers asked, "Aren't you the new captain of the U-405? "Yes, I am. Glad to welcome you," said a full officer with 3 gold stripes on his sleeve and a knight's cross under his collar. "I am the captain of the patrol ship Winter. Meet my staff." He introduced me to the rest of the officers and ordered the day watchman to bring another device. Winter himself needed no introduction. He was known to all submariners. At the beginning of the war, he had achieved a remarkable achievement, sinking British ships with a total tonnage of over 150,000 register gross tons. He was one of our last surviving aces. While I was eating breakfast, Winter and the other officers gave me the latest news. The Schnurkel complexes had arrived in dry dock for testing on 3 subs. But I heard nothing more good. British planes were constantly making sorties and dropping magnetic mines on the fairways leading out of Brest Bay into the open sea. The unfavourable trend of submarine warfare continued, although we continued to wait for the long-promised new weapons and better submarines. A few of our obsolete U-boats still roamed around the British Isles, becoming targets of hunting from the air or enemy surface ships. Now aircraft from US aircraft carriers and escorts patrolled even the mid-Atlantic. And after all, this black hole for a long time was free from Allied control. And here is the result. 4 out of 5 of our submarines failed to return after their trips to the base, a level of losses that far exceeded the sunk enemy ships. When the conversation turned to the war as a whole, I noticed that the officers were not concerned about the position of our troops on the line near Monte Cassino, or even about the outcome of the Russian campaign, which was not going as predicted by the Wehrmacht command. They talked mainly about the threat of an Allied landing on the continent. No one knew when or where it would happen, but no one seemed to doubt that it was bound to happen. The officers also talked about our recent efforts to further strengthen our strong coastal defences designed to repel Allied landings at the very edge of the sea. Our leaders repeatedly reiterated that the Atlantic rampart was insurmountable, and no one questioned their statements. Defeat seemed impossible. The very thought of it was perceived as treason. Winter was about to leave. "Oberleutnant Werner," he said in farewell, "you will see your submarine crew at 1400 hours. Until then, make yourself comfortable and think about what you will say to your submariners." I tried to take the advice of this accommodating, good-looking officer. I settled down in a large corner room in the southeast wing of the base's housing complex and, after taking a shower, tried to think through my little speech. Nothing noteworthy came to mind, however. Then I sat down at my desk to write a draft of the speech. But that didn't work either, so I decided to tour the concrete submarine bunker and other facilities on the base. At 2 p.m. I met with Captain Winter and my submarine crew on the Flotilla Plaza. In an impromptu speech, I told the crew that I was a long-time friend of the U-415, having seen her while refuelling in the mid-Atlantic last year. I said that I knew of the success of the boat's crew and was honoured to be her commander. I assured the submariners that nothing would change in their usual routine on the submarine, and that as long as I was on board, I would strive for new victories over the enemy. I shook hands with each submariner, and at 14:20 I took the boat under my command. At 14:25, I gave my first order to the XO to prepare the boat for a 30-minute training exercise in the bay. I decided to train the crew based on my own understanding of submarine warfare. The XO led the crew to the bottom of the hill. I, along with the chief engineer and the second watch officer, followed them, asking my companions about their service on the U-4M5. As it turned out, the chief engineer had been on the boat since it was manned, but the XO and second watch officer had limited combat experience. I realized that I would have to perform a significant portion of their duties at first. U-415 was waiting for us in her bunker breach. I descended through the hatch into the deckhouse and immediately encountered a problem. The periscope in the deckhouse was of the old type, and I was used to a fully automated instrument equipped with a rotating chair, electric traction, various gadgets, and integrated into an electronic system. Using this prehistoric periscope required squatting to look through the eyepieces, and moving the barrel up and down required acrobatic art. A close inspection of the submarine revealed no other defects except for its age. It was an old workhorse. Nevertheless, a radar equipped with many new gadgets, plus 2 twin 20mm guns and an automatic 37mm made up for the lack of a modern periscope. Beginning at noon that day and for the next 3 days, I drove the boat around Brest Bay, trained the crew with underwater dives, and gave the gunners the opportunity to fire live charges from the guns. I added several novelties to the combat training which I considered extremely important. The crew, who had a well-developed instinct for self-preservation, adopted them. I made the submariners work hard, bringing them to the peak of combat readiness and deepening my relationship with them. On the 4th day, I was so convinced that the boat was ready to go that I could report to Winter. From that point on, everything went according to the daily routine. The duties I had performed for years were now assumed by my officers. I had an opportunity to prepare myself mentally and physically for the campaign. On the 3rd day, I received my first operational orders, and shortly after breakfast met with Winter in his office. He calmly and briefly explained to me the combat mission. We had temporarily suspended extended Atlantic campaigns and favoured short-term raids in areas where convoy routes converge. Take a look. Winter unfolded a large yellow nautical chart and pointed out the area that headquarters had designated for submarine operations under my command. As you can see, your quadrant is in the strategic zone on the approaches to the English Channel. After studying the map, I saw that the depth of the ocean in the specified area did not exceed 150 metres. Operating in such shallow water has its advantages and disadvantages. I also realised that there is air reconnaissance and concentrated groups of enemy hunters. There would be little chance of surfacing there to ventilate the boat's compartments and recharge the batteries. Under such conditions, the submarine would be unlikely to survive without a schnurkel when squadrons of airplanes and destroyer squadrons began to hunt for it. Common sense told me that U-415 was doomed, and yet I couldn't believe that I had saved myself from destruction for so long only to fall victim to obsolete equipment. I accepted the order, folded it and slipped it into my tunic pocket. Then I saluted my superior and walked out. Finally, the hour to put to sea arrived. 9:30 p.m., April 11th, 1944. The crew gathered on the aft deck. We were not seen off by well-wishers on the pier. There was no music or flowers. In the concrete bunker, my commands sounded deafeningly. U-415 slowly stepped stern forward into the shallow waters of the inner bay, then turned and followed the nervously moving minesweeper down the long dark passage leading into the Atlantic. I had sailed this route before, but now I was in command of the submarine crew, responsible for 58 men of the crew, and at a time when our chances of success and rescue were minimal. At 22:45, the escort turned around and without warning lay on a reverse course. Its captain wished us a happy hunt. That message had long since lost all meaning. It reminded me that our going to sea was hardly a secret, because in anticipation of the imminent landing of the Allies, giving the French hope of liberation, Every dry dock worker, bar waitress or brothel girl was eager to report any of our actions to the British. With the departure of the escort, we hurried forward. It was necessary to get under water as soon as possible, for no one wanted to be bombed on the surface. But besides the threat from the air, we had to reckon with the minefields set up by the British. In spite of our great desire to submerge, we were forced to continue in a surface position until the boat reached a deeper depth where we could avoid the mines and take cover from the depth bombs. All this time we were continually tapped by radar pulses. "New pulse, course 140, volume increases," reported the radar operator on the intercom. "Check the depth with echo sounder, report constantly. I commanded from the bridge to the central station. 31, 32, 33. No, this depth was not suitable for diving and thus for rescue from mines. Radar signals are getting stronger," the voice in the intercom warned insistently. 37, 38, 40 meters. "Pulses, volume 4, shouted a voice from below. "Alert!" I waited a few more seconds, expecting to see the searchlight beam from the attacking aircraft, then ducked through the hatch. The submarine roared, moving in an arc and diving starboard underwater. But in the shallow water the dive was too slow. As soon as I mentally noted this fact, for I had never had to dive so close to shore before, there were explosions. 1, 2, 3, 4. They tore through the water column and each time struck the hull of the boat on the port side, hurling it farther to the side. Then, after a powerful jolt, the boat reached the bottom at a depth of 46 meters. There was no explosion of mines that might have been here. It is unlikely that at this distance from the harbour there were any at all. I decided that I would no longer follow the order in force, which forbade submerging at a depth of less than 80 meters. At midnight, U-450 again rose to the surface all alone, but also in anticipation of the appearance of British planes. I noted the time on the luminous dial of my watch to determine the interval between our dive and surfacing. 30 minutes later, after we had travelled a distance of 9 miles, 3 insistent radar pulses caused us to go underwater again. The submarine had sunk to 55 meters when 12 explosions occurred, 4 in each series. The enemy was not sparing bombs. He wanted to achieve our destruction with a guarantee. We surfaced and submerged again and again in an endless game of cat and mouse. By sundown we had gone underwater for the 8th time, and the number of bombs the enemy had used on us had reached 40. U-415 moved silently underwater in the direction of the entrance to the channel. Soon our acoustic instruments picked up the faint noise of propellers and clicks of Azdic far to the west. A group of hunters were hurrying in our direction. The direction of the submarine's movement was indicated to them by a series of explosions of bombs dropped by an airplane. I lay down on my bunk. My eyes were closed, but my brain was working hard. The noise of the destroyer's propellers could soon be heard without headphones. At times it seemed that the hunters had made contact with their prey. Their radar drills continuously drilled the steel hull of the boat. But time passed. Every hour we were advancing 2 miles on a north-northwest course, and far past noon we broke away from the destroyers. The moment was fast approaching when we could surface, and daring to disregard the enemy's aerial reconnaissance, though the beating of our hearts had reached its limit. However, we were given a chance to take a breath of fresh air and recharge our vital batteries. At 10:15 p.m., the U-415 surfaced in the cloudless night. I breathed in a lungful of cold air. A fresh breeze was blowing in from the west. Flakes of foam flew into our faces. What followed was a repeat of the previous night. When the volume of the Azdic pulses became unbearable and an airplane was about to appear in the sky, we made an emergency dive. The submarine sagged from the blast wave, stumbled, rolled, lost control, but then levelled off, straightened up and continued silent movement until we surfaced again on the surface, where tracer trails of aircraft and exhaust fumes of enemy ships had not yet dissipated. We played this deadly game all night until our batteries were fully charged. As the day wore on, the dive relieved us of the nerve-wracking risk. 5 days and nights, U-4 broke through the bomb bursts. On the 6th, we arrived in the target area and were again bombarded. On the 3rd day of patrolling in the grid square, BF-15 acoustician reported almost in a whisper, "Noise streak just off the port side." It was just what I wanted to hear, the deafening rhythmic beating of the transport's piston engines. The clock read 09:15. Judging by the noise, the convoy was a considerable distance away. I began my first attack with a command, medium forward, dive to periscope depth, all hands to stations, prepare torpedo tubes for battle. Instantly the sailors, machinists, and mechanics rushed to their places in their underwear, socks and slippers. I slipped into the radio room and put on my headphones. The symphony of mechanical sounds coming from propellers, turbines, diesels and piston engines was a joy to hear. I was overwhelmed with the urge to stop the damn propellers from turning. I gave up listening to the growing noise and rushed into the deckhouse. The crew was waiting for my orders. "Periscope up! Stop, that's enough!" I knelt in front of the outdated, unfamiliar instrument and fixed my eyes on the eyepieces. All I could see before my eyes was a light green expanse of water. Suddenly, I was blinded by the sunlight. The visibility of the sea surface disappeared. "Periscope down!" "No, not like that. Too low. Higher, higher, now lower. That's it." In the field of view of the periscope showed black superstructures of transports, which against the pale blue sky resembled characters of the theatre of shadows. They, swaying, dragged eastward in a slender column without any premonition of trouble. No wonder, for they had crossed the Atlantic in perfect safety. I turned the periscope around to check the situation behind me, and counted 7 patrolmen diligently circling the convoy at various distances. This show of force meant that we had to act quickly. I lowered the periscope, ordered the 4 aft torpedo tubes to be ready for a fan salvo, then reassessed the situation on the sea surface. U-4 cautiously crept up to the cluster of transports. The distance separating her from the convoy was gradually but noticeably shortening. Black silhouettes turned into ships and then into huge monsters. 4 destroyers ploughed through the sea in close proximity to us. I realized that I had time to approach the convoy at the desired distance. Range correction. 2,000 meters now. Periscope higher, higher still, now a little lower. That's it. The new range of 2,000 meters is set. Target locked. Fan salvo. TOVs. Fire. One after another, torpedoes jumped out of the apparatuses and rushed towards the imposing formation of transports, escorts, minesweepers. The 58 submariners froze, listening to the rhythm of their beating hearts. 2 minutes passed, still no sign of the targets. I pointed my periscope at the convoy moving ahead, almost mesmerized by the sight. And then 1, 2, 3 explosions in rapid succession. 3 mushroom-shaped clouds of black smoke rose up in the column of transports. Then the huge grey side of the escort blocked the view. Alert, diving to a depth of 150 meters. The helmsman raised and lowered the engine telegraph handle 3 times. We fell silent in tense anticipation of bursting depth bombs. U-4 rushed to the bottom. Her propellers were spinning furiously. Only I knew what had happened. The escort had discovered us because I'd kept my periscope on the surface too long. A serial explosion rumbled overhead not far from the deckhouse. In short intervals, the boat was shaken by 6 powerful tremors. For a few moments only the scraping of our horizontal rudders was heard, then a new series of explosions threw the boat further into the depths. Glavmet, for a few seconds, levelled the boat to sit on the ground with an even keel. This manoeuvre brought another series of explosions upon us. We could hear the splash of the warheads being dropped into the water, and there seemed to be no escape from them. A series of 12 explosions rumbled by, a living hell. Somewhere a valve blew off, and a fountain of water as thick as a hand burst into the centre passage. Upstairs, the escorts came together to finish us off. We could hear their manoeuvres without any acoustic devices. A final series of explosions took our shuddering boat at a fork. Then the devilishly thrashing propellers heralded a new series of dropped ordnance. Although the sun had hidden behind the horizon and the hunters were plunged into darkness, they continued to hurl their bomb cassettes. Their explosions pinned our boat to the sandy bottom and shook it continuously. By 06:00 the next morning, we had been under bombardment for 18 hours. Glavme managed to keep the boat buoyant despite countless leaks, damage, ruptured pipelines and valves, lack of electricity and compressed air. At noon, the intensity of the bombardment had not diminished. Apparently, the British escorts were taking turns. We could hear new ships arriving in our dive area and continuing their business with fresh forces. Evening came on, yet the ferocious blows upon us did not abate. We had long since become accustomed to the clicks of the Aztec pulses and the noise of the revolving propellers, which went on, reaching a maximum volume. These were the moments when a mass of buckshot was thrown down, when the bursting bombs pounded the steel hull of the boat with shockwaves, when our hearts sank and something flashed in the dark hull and splashed water. These were moments when we felt buried in the silt. And yet somehow we remained alive. Night came again. The British had been blasting us for 37 hours. They had dropped more than 300 warheads and were not going to stop their hunt. However, at Olo 15, the haphazard movement of the hunters led us to believe that their patience, or maybe their ammunition, had run out. The escort's propellers stopped turning, then the number of revolutions increased, and then decreased. After a few interminable minutes, the noise of the escort's propellers, gradually receding, died out over the eastern horizon. The silence struck the ear with its suddenness. Every sound was amplified to the rumble of the explosion. The dripping of liquid on the deck plates, the splashing of water in the bottom, the cooing of heavy-breathing men, the ticking of wristwatches. Slowly, very slowly, the crew released themselves from the stress, realizing at last that the bombing was over. An hour later, the U-415 burst to the surface to a life-giving source of fresh air. I squeezed through the hatch to the bridge. The diesel engines started, the fans whirred, the boat picked up speed and raced westward in the darkness. Before dawn, we went underwater. Glavme held the moving boat at a depth of 25 meters, giving use the opportunity to receive the first for 2 days of radiograms. Judging by the reports, Berlin, Hamburg, Hanover were again subjected to massive air raids. In Italy, the Allies broke through our front and the Soviets undertook a broad offensive in southern Russia. We also learned from headquarters radiograms that while U-415 was between life and death, 3 of our submarines were lost. U-342 was bombed and sunk. U-448 and U-515 did not respond to headquarters inquiries for several days and probably died. We intercepted radiograms addressed to other subs that were believed to still be afloat. One of the radiograms was intended for us, U-405, to stop combat operations, report their coordinates, return to base immediately. We dutifully surfaced, reported the coordinates and results of the battle to the base. Expecting our radiogram to be intercepted by the British, we prepared for their long-range bombers. We had only minutes to recharge our batteries. U-415 was separated from her concrete shelter at Brest by a distance of about 300 miles. She could have covered that distance within 30 hours, travelling in a surface position at high speed. Instead, we were forced to resume our periodic dives. For 4 days we moved underwater, avoiding the most elaborate attempts by the British to sink the boat. And finally we approached the rocky shore of Brittany, surfaced in the night illuminated by the sickle of the month, following in the keel of our escort to the safe confines of Brest. About midnight our good old horse took her place under a concrete shelter. The pier was illuminated by a faint diffused light. Only a few military officials from the flotilla took the time to greet us. The boat's crew stood in complete silence as Winter took my report. Soon I was seated at the table in the officers' mess, next to the senior officer. Taking advantage of the pause, I asked him what had been occupying me for the past 5 days. "Herr Captain, why did headquarters order us back? Are we going to get our schnurkel at last?" "Come to my office tomorrow on this matter," said Winter. "But now have dinner and tell me about your trip." It's always the same, the constant need to surface and get a breath of fresh air, to snatch a moment when the Tommies can't see you, to submerge if they're fussing nearby, to surface again when they turn their backs on you. The problem is finding the opportune moment to take your chance. As I devoured the cold pork and washed it down with beer, I told Winter about the long hunt of the English, which might not have made the current dinner happen. When Winter left, the crew of the U-415 continued to celebrate their return from a successful campaign for quite some time. Before retiring to my room, I sat for an hour with the officers of my boat at the bar. After washing off in the bathtub, I stretched out in bed, covered with white sheets, and soon fell asleep. The next day at 3:30 p.m, I went into Winter's office. First, he asked how my submariners were settling in. I said they were well taken care of. "Good," Winter said, and continued. "Now about the reason for your recall from the campaign. As you may have heard, the High Command is expecting an Allied landing on the continent in the near future. According to all indications, it could take place in May. There's a lot of speculation about where they might land. Do you know anything definite about that?" "I don't know. Perhaps in Norway. There's speculation that they might try the Bay of Biscay, but more likely they'll try the coast near Le Havre, which is the shortest distance from British ports. In any case, we must remain vigilant and alert. Your boat will be docked immediately. Only the most urgent repairs will be allowed. In 10 days' time, you will receive your battle orders. By that time, you must have the boat on 6-hour alert. Further instructions you will receive in this office from the senior officer of the Headquarters Unit West, when the command will decide on our counterattack." Remembering Winter's concern about the condition of the boat and crew, I again poked at the burning issue. "It is quite likely, Herr Captain, that the fulfillment of our future combat mission will require the boat to be equipped with a schnurkel. Is there any provision for this?" "I do not know yet," he answered evasively. "There are just no more schnurkels. It's a pity, of course, but you'll have to do without it, and many other captains too. We will have to counteract the Allied landings with what we have. Herr Captain, HQ must realize that we will not be able to carry out combat missions with confidence without the schnurkels. I understand and sympathize with you, but I have no authority to change the situation. I wish I could help you, but there are limits to what I can do." I left Winter's office with a firm determination to get a schnurkel at all costs and equip U-415 with it before the Allied landing operation began. Judging from the enemy's armament that we had observed at sea, his invasion force must have been so large that no submarine of ours could be used for combat purposes without the schnurkel. I was disturbed by the thought of how poorly headquarters had imagined the extent of Allied combat power, and how little the chiefs in Berlin had learned from our terrible losses. I took U-415 to dry dock and negotiated the extent of the repairs. Then I called the shipyards at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire to inquire about the availability of spare schnurkels there, though without success. They were supplied in such meagre quantities that only 7 submarines based at Brest were equipped. One day, a ray of hope flashed for me. One of the dock engineers reported that he saw a dismantled schnurkel in the freight depot of Montparnasse station in Paris. However, all my attempts to purchase and deliver the necessary equipment to Brest were drowned in a sea of bureaucratic formalities. Gradually, I came to terms with the bitter fact that I would have to go to sea again without a schnurkel. Within a few days, individual submarines came or chained themselves to the bay. They were only a fraction of those ordered to return to repel the Allied landings. In the first 4 months of 1944, more than 55 of our boats were destroyed, about 80% of those that went to sea. The paltry tonnage of boats sunk during this period did not justify the losses we suffered. The very preservation of the boats had to be the first priority, as they could serve the Millennial Reich, which was in mortal danger. With the arrival of U-1801, the thin trickle of submarines returning to port dried up. U-311 was sunk on the way back to port. U-392 failed to rendezvous at the rocks with our escort. U-625 and U-653 were lost in the Bay of Biscay. U-744 and U-603 disappeared without sending distress radiograms. In addition to the boats that were based at Brest and intended to strengthen our defences on the eve of the Allied invasion, 20 submarines from Norway were sent to use, and all without a Schnurkel. The crews of these subs had no experience in fighting the enemy's anti-submarine weapons. Only 2 of them arrived at the port of destination. In total, there were only 15 submarines left in Brest, 7 of them equipped with Schnurkels, and we had to defend the 1,000-year-old Reich against millions of Allied paratroopers. May came in an atmosphere of fragrance of magnolias and lilacs. A faint breeze from the ocean spread them over the vast pastures of Brittany. When I left the coast at the beginning of April, the warm breeze from the south and the individual buds blossoming gave only a premonition of the coming of spring. During my absence, the trees had leafed out, the grass had turned green, flowers were blooming, and the weather was summer hot. The personnel of the shipyards worked around the clock under a common concrete roof to repair and equip 15 submarines to fulfill their most important combat mission. Torpedoes, fuel and food were delivered to the pier at the same time to shorten the time it took to load them into the boats. Our engine men volunteered to make a host of minor repairs to ensure that the boats were combat-ready by the target date. While activity in the shipyards was declining and nervousness was increasing in the base headquarters, the enemy had completed his preparations for a huge landing operation across the Channel. He intensified air raids on the ports of the coast of the Bay of Biscay, keeping Hurleyus and the air defence forces in suspense. Every night squadrons of Allied planes swept over our bases, dotting the bays and fairways with magnetic mines. Every day our minesweepers went out in search of floating death hidden underwater, and the rocks of the Brest Bay coastline echoed with the explosions of miners. Numerous squadrons of Anglo-American bombers invaded the Skis of France, systematically bombing its territory, disabling highways and railroads, stations, warehouses, airfields, barracks, bridges, villages, and towns. They were destroying beautiful France, hitherto hardly touched by war. On one of these sunny, ominous days, the senior officer of Headquarters West, Captain Rosing, made an expected visit to the 1st Flotilla compound. He briefed us on Headquarters' plan to destroy the Allied landing fleet. In the role of hospitable host to a high-ranking guest and submarine commanders of the 9th Flotilla based across town was Captain Winter. As we settled around the conference table, I turned my attention to my associates in the upcoming extraordinary operation. To my left sat my friend Heinz Sieder, commander of U-984. On the right, Dieter Sasser with U-413. Besides them, there were Teddy Leshton, commander of U-373, Heinz Marbach with U-953, Bodenberg with U-256, Uhl with U-269, Hartmann with U-441, Stark with U-740, Buget with U-629, Kanakfus with U-821, Machulat with U-247, Stamer with U-354, Becker with U-218, and Cordes with U-763. All of us were young, dedicated, and determined to win the battle we had been preparing for so long. 8 of us, including myself, had our own thoughts on the upcoming combat operation. However, Admiral Dönitz did not think it necessary to consult with those who were to do the impossible, to stop the landing fleet, and even without the help of Schnurkel. The participants of the meeting prepared to listen. Captain Rosing smoothed his head with his hair as if the dislodged hair prevented him from thinking. He began to speak only after he had tidied it up. "Gentlemen, as you know, an Allied invasion can be expected at any moment. You must be ready to put to sea at any hour. Since our intelligence has not been able to establish the exact date and location of the landing, I will only give you general instructions. We must be ready to repel landings anywhere. Norway has 22 submarines in readiness for this purpose. Another 22 are concentrated on the coast of the Bay of Biscay in the ports of Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, and Bordeaux. It is most likely, however, that the invasion force will simply cross the English Channel and try to land on our coast 50 miles from the ports of England. Then you will have to join the fight. The orders from headquarters are concise and precise. Attack and sink landing craft. As a last resort, ram enemy ships to destroy them. Dead silence reigned in the room. The 15 captains, experienced submariners, could not believe what they were hearing. It was sheer madness. We had fought fiercely through months of defeat and loss to preserve the subs and their crews from destruction. Now that there are so few of them left, HQ is proposing to sacrifice all that was salvageable without regard for the continuation of the war. It is ridiculous to use a submarine as a torpedo. Have we really been gaining combat experience and skill for suicide? Did this senseless gesture justify our demise on the seafloor? I pulled myself together and asked the emissary of headquarters, "Herr Kapitän, does this mean that we must ram enemy ships, even if it remains possible to return to port for more torpedoes?" "The order is to ram them. That is the directive I've been instructed to convey to each and every one of you. Gentlemen, I'll be frank, you will probably not be able to repeat the attack. That's why the order is to attack so vigorously, even if it means voluntary self-destruction." Now it was clear. He conveyed the meaning and content of the order quite accurately, leaving us with nothing else but to act in the manner of the Japanese kamikaze. It occurred to me that this order reflects the headquarters' realization of the hopelessness of the war, but I did not yet dare to draw conclusions from this conclusion. Hein Cedar, whose boat was equipped with a schnurkel, also allowed himself to speak out. "I suggest in this regard that the submarines with schnurkel were sent to the English Channel now, Herr Kapitän. It is more advantageous for us to attack first a few hours after the landing party has put to sea and before it lands on our shore." "We cannot afford to endanger our submarines before the landing begins," objected our guest. "You will be ordered to put to sea well in advance. We have a good early warning system along our coast. The details will be brought to your attention the moment you leave port. If, gentlemen, you have any further questions, now is the time to ask them. What was there to ask? We've been trained to follow orders without question. And yet, we 15 captains unilaterally discussed the not fully disclosed provisions of the order, and concluded that we are free to make tactical manoeuvres. But if we encounter an invasion force, we attack it until we've used up all our torpedoes, then we ram it." The meeting participants left the meeting place. Everyone left, overcome with gloomy thoughts. I retired to my room, turned on the radio and tried to relax in a comfortable chair. I figured that the vanguards of the invasion forces would not allow the submarines, deprived of schnurkel, to take favourable positions in the English Channel when the landing operation had already begun. I was sure that 7 of my friends would come to a similar conclusion. Only 7 submarines equipped with schnurkels had any chance of successfully attacking the invasion force. So at best, our command could count on 7 subs in its plans to repel a landing across the Channel. These men would be facing, if my estimates of Allied naval power are anything to go by, an invasion fleet of thousands of transports, warships and landing craft, not to mention the countless aircraft that would cover the landing operation. Of course, 7 submarines are incapable of stopping such an armada. Even the hope that they could inflict any significant losses on the Allies was a childish illusion. If our army and air force prove incapable of stopping the invasion on the seaside beaches and dropping the landing force into the sea, then we should only count on the Almighty God to save our souls and Germany. The setting of a 6-hour alert deprived the crews of the 15 doomed subs of the opportunity to stroll around town. Vacations were cancelled. I made sure to distract my submariners from their unhappy thoughts. Bus rides, walking tours, games and competitions filled their leisure time. Vocational training was organised. Captain Winter did his best to brighten our lives. We captains spent sunny days at the Lothresha Flotilla Resort, swimming in the sea, sunbathing, playing chess and bridge with girls from naval administration establishments who were unaware of our fateful future. We no longer spoke aloud of the Allied landing, but we thought of it constantly, just as we thought of our imminent doom. Everything reminded us of death, especially the device for saving our lives. One day we saw a submarine exercise in Brest Bay, equipped with schnorkels. We, sailors and officers of submarines without schnorkels, watched the manoeuvres of our comrades with black envy. When we watched the small tops of the schnorkels barely reach the surface of the sea, leaving only a short, foamy trail behind them, it seemed to us that our comrades were insured from death, while we would not be killed. On Sunday, May 28, we, 15 submarine commanders, were invited to the SS Division to see with their own eyes what measures are being taken to strengthen one of the defences of the Atlantic berm. We were taken by truck to the Channel coast and shown sophisticated military equipment, long-term mobile firing points and fortifications. Infantry units conducted impressive manoeuvres, showing various types of equipment preparing to repel an amphibious assault. The division was staffed with personnel of a very young age. Many of the soldiers were still young men under the age of 18, and the officers were not much older. Nevertheless, it seemed to us that the Army, Luftwaffe, and SS were capable of nipping the landing operation in the bud. We returned to Brest more relaxed about the fate of our defences. During the night, we registered 7 incursions of the same enemy aircraft into the skies over Brest Bay. The next morning, May 29th, the adjutant to the base commander relayed instructions that all subs remain at their bunker anchorages until further notice. The Tommies dropped one of their mines just in front of the bunker, he explained to me. An anti-aircraft gunner on the roof of one of our buildings had spotted where it had fallen. Our minesweepers will take care of it. The bay will be cleared by nightfall. "Oh, those Tommies!" I exclaimed in indignation. "Soon they'll be putting their presents in our bed." The adjutant, of course, understood what I meant. For the rest of the day, the 2 minesweepers whirled around in the inner bay near the approaches to the bunker where the 15 subs were trapped. However, they did not locate the mine. By evening, the search ceased and the bay was open to the movement of ships. The issue was over. The anti-aircraft gunner was a victim of psychosis, to which we all succumbed. Days of tense waiting were interspersed with sleepless nights. Everything indicated that the day of the Allied landing was approaching. More frequent air raids, the activation of the French underground, the growing antipathy to us on the part of the local population, the aggressiveness of propaganda in the German language of the British radio station Calais, the maximum height of the tide in early June. On June 4th, when a British squadron of 4 liberators made a sunset approach to bombard and destroy our submarines protected by a concrete canopy, I realised that the hour of our final battle was very near. And so the 5th came. In the early morning hours, when the chirping of the birds had not yet been silenced by the heat, I took the submariners out for a walk. We marched in formation through the neighbourhood of Brest, with a cheerful song that woke up the still sleeping Frenchmen. The 7-kilometre excursion pleased my guys. It distracted them from their work routine. In the afternoon, I left the crew in the care of my officers and went into town with Hein Zieder, captain of the U-984. About 6 p.m, we stopped by the office to learn something about the Allied landing. Since nothing new had been reported to us, we decided to have some appetizing meals in town for dinner instead of the skinny sandwiches served at the flotilla bar. We stopped by one of our favourite restaurants and ordered 2 large lobsters and baked snails as an appetizer. Zieder and I enjoyed a classic Breton dinner, but were deprived of the opportunity to socialise with the pretty girls, who had become overly shy and uncooperative lately. I remembered Marguerite from St. Denis and thought bitterly of the fact that I would never see her again in Paris. When we returned to the base compound, it was plunged into darkness and silence. Everywhere the lights were out, its occupants seemed to be asleep. Only the night watch and the radio operators on duty were awake. In the middle of the night I was awakened by the noise of fists pounding on my door. The duty officer was shouting in an agitated voice, "Alarm! The Allies are advancing! Alarm!" In a second I was at the door. "Where did they land?" "In Normandy. The landing is in full swing." He ran to wake up my friends. I turned on the light and looked at the clock. They showed 03:47, June 6, 1944, I thought with annoyance. While the Allies were boarding ships and landing crafts, warming the engines of their fighters and bombers, crossed the English Channel to give us an airstrike, we were serenely sleeping on snow-white sheets 200 miles from where we should be now. In my excited state, I pulled on my military uniform and didn't shave. There was little to do. I leisurely gathered my things, folded them neatly and put them in my closet. I slipped a toothbrush and a tube of toothpaste into the breast pocket of my green uniform, put on my tunic and closed the room, walked down the stairs and out of the building to the concrete bunker. My hour had come. I would not return again. When I crossed the gangway, my boat's crew was already lined up on deck for roll call. The XO reported, "Herr Oberleutnant, the crew is assembled. The submarine is ready to go." I lifted the visor of my cap and looked at the row of submariners. At ease, boys. You know that the enemy has already landed on our shore, or is landing now. We can no longer prevent him, but we can stop new shipments of weapons and reinforcements to the landed paratroopers. We'll do everything we can. Prepare to put to sea. Everyone to your stations. There was no need to tell them the whole truth. As for my crew, for them, this trip was to be business as usual. I paced the deck, waiting for the signal to go to sea. Nearby stood the U-629, commanded by Bouguer. With him, I had emptied quite a few bottles of wine at La Thresher as we fell into a streak of carefree living and fun. Although only a few hours separated us from the final battle, we nevertheless exchanged smiles and good wishes. Then I continued pacing the deck. Minutes passed, an hour passed. At last night slowly passed. As a new day dawned over the Normandy coast, the largest landing operation of all was in full swing. A huge fleet, more than 4,000 landing ships with 30 divisions of the Allies on board, 800 destroyers, cruisers, battleships, warships of other classes, approached the coast of Europe, which was subjected to fire raid 10,000 enemy aircraft. Divisions of parachutists dropped from the sky behind the defensive lines of our troops, and countless gliders landed soldiers, tanks, guns, and ammunition there. While the French soil shook from the explosions of millions of bombs and grenades, while the first waves of paratroopers were destroyed by the concentrated fire of the defenders, while only a few hundred of our planes took to the skies, and the resistance of our infantry and combat equipment slowly weakened under the blows from the air and sea. 15 submarines were idle waiting under the canopy of the concrete shelter in Brest. 21 more were held in ports on the coast of the Bay of Biscay, and 22 others remained safely in the fjords of Norway. At 10:00 a.m., the order to put to sea had still not been received. The command did not utter a word. Our lads took a radio set on deck to listen to the news. The heroic resistance of our armies was reported, and how they were dropping the paratroopers back into the sea. Fanfares and military marches sounded, designed to instill in the population that the greatest battle of all was sure to end in our complete victory. The crews of the 15 submarines, put on the highest alert, welcomed the news and tap-danced on deck to the beat of the military music. Orders were now being given and cancelled within minutes. Gradually the confusion increased. The submarines at noon were still at the pier. Rumours and false alarms followed each other like young bulls during a panic run. At 2:40 p.m, we 15 captains were ordered to report to Winter's office. There was dead silence as Winter handed each of us our orders in a sealed envelope. I opened my blue envelope, unfolded the red-coloured piece of paper that contained Lyon's belated instructions, and stared at the teletype line. The letters crawled on top of each other. I read the whole thing. U-415 to put to sea at midnight and proceed in surface position at full speed to the coast of Great Britain between Cape Lazard and Hartland Point. Attack and destroy enemy transports. The order was even more insane than the one that had come from headquarters earlier. It required me and 7 of my friends, those whose boats were not equipped with schnorkels, to remain on the surface of the sea and proceed without any protection to the south coast of the British Isles, at a time when the sky was blackened by 1,000 planes, and the sea was swarming with hundreds of destroyers and patrol ships. It is quite obvious that we would not have escaped destruction until the moment when the opportunity to ram the transports in British ports would have presented itself. The 7 submarines equipped with schnorkels were more fortunate. They were ordered to proceed in a submerged state to the area where the Allied invasion was taking place. Slow progress underwater partly delayed their inevitable demise. Captain Winter walked pale and sullen. He shook hands firmly with the commanders he had befriended. He had done all he could to make our last days on land any pleasant and meaningful. There was nothing more he could do. The clock showed 5+ in the evening when I returned to the concrete bunker. There was no radio to be heard, but the huge concrete vault resonated the melodies of the songs of 800 submariners, desperate to go to sea to fight the enemy, even if it meant inevitable death. At 9 p.m., as night fell on the battlefields of Normandy, 15 submarines entered the bay. The night was clear. The stars twinkled faintly in the still bright sky. Soon the full moon was to rise to light our way to the Atlantic. 21:30. 7 submarines equipped with schnorkels went underwater in Brest Bay and began to disappear one after another at intervals of 5 to 10 minutes. Their departure went unnoticed by the enemy's aircraft, which were making turns not far from the shore and ready to strike at anything that moved on the surface of the sea. While the U-boats moved underwater in Kielwarte formation through the narrow passage from the bay to the channel, we, less privileged, positioned ourselves alongside the escort, waiting for the huge red circle of the moon to rise and show us the way. 22:30. The Coast Guard ships started toward the mouth of the bay. As soon as they came to the operational space, our diesels coughed and black silhouettes of 8 subs followed the minesweeper. The first was U-441, under the command of Captain Hartmann. As the senior among us, he took the role of leader. Behind the stern of his boat followed U-413 Zasse. Next in line was Teddy Leshton's U-373. After her U-740 Stark, U-629 Bugsy, U-821 Knackfusa, led by me U-415, and closing the line U-256 Bodenberg. In the southeast, the full moon rose above the horizon. It hung in the sky like a giant lantern, illuminating the long line of submarines and clearly reflected in the serene sea. Against the rules, all the submariners wore their yellow life jackets. The bridge of the boat was littered with piles of ammunition, the deckhouse turned into an arsenal. The anti-aircraft gunners were on duty at their guns in tense anticipation of the first enemy airplane. I was in my place, trying to keep the boat strictly in the keel of U-821 and keep a distance of 300 metres from her. 23:10. The first radar pulses were picked up by our bug and fly as soon as the shore disappeared from view. A report from below, 6 pulses in front, rapidly increasing, caused concern among the submariners on the bridge. Everyone strained their ears upwind, eager to look farther out. I looked around the bridge's armoured guardrail, but even in the bright moonlight I could not spot a single winged monster. 23:20. The head of our formation entered the open sea. In the presence of escorts, 8 subs moved further into the area of the enemy's anti-submarine defence, cutting the silvery surface of the sea. The squeal of increasing radar pulses and the stream of danger warnings from below did not cease. 23:40. Suddenly fireworks erupted on the left of our course 5 miles ahead. We had been warned that several of our destroyers were making the passage from Lorient to Brest. We were not to mistake them for British ships. I focused my binoculars on the flashpoint and saw 7 destroyers repelling air attacks in a traverse formation. Both sides exchanged thousands of tracer bullets and shells. Flares hovered above our ships, adding their bright white light to the yellow glow of the moon. As we approached, The noise of battle intensified. Anti-aircraft guns were blaring, airplane engines howling. Tommies, noticing our approach, stopped their furious attacks, fearing to get caught in the crossfire of destroyers and submarines. The destroyers raced eastward past our long line of minesweepers, who, seizing the chance to return to port under heavy protection, left our formation and hurried to get into the destroyer's keel. Their unexpected manoeuvre left 8 subs at the mercy of British aircraft. At this point, they all acted in concert. I commanded, "Triple speed, full speed ahead. Fire on targets without warning." June 7th. At 0.35, our subs continued to move at maximum speed into the Atlantic. The diesels hummed, exhaust gases spewed out, the pulses of the ASDIC drummed ceaselessly on the hull. I caught myself constantly looking at my watch, as if it could tell me when the boat would get a fatal blow. Euro 30. The ASDIC's pulses were changing rapidly from a prolonged moan to a shrill shriek. Apparently the Tommies were patrolling the skies at various distances from our procession. They must have thought we were crazy. Occasionally I could hear the roar of aircraft engines at a fairly close distance, but I could not detect an airplane. The hands of the clock crept slowly across the dial. The British were apparently waiting for reinforcements. Our vision sharpened and our hearts beat fast in anticipation of an air raid. 12. The fight began. Suddenly the head submarines were attacked. In different directions flew tracer bullets, then heard the battle of anti-aircraft guns. Fountains of water soared into the sky. 01.17. One of the enemy planes caught fire. It flashed like a comet, flew over the headboat, dropped 4 bombs, and crashed into the ocean. From the explosions of bombs lost control of U-413 Zaze. Her port vertical rudder jammed and the boat was knocked out of commission. She quickly lost speed and disappeared under the surface of the ocean. 1.25. The airplane made a run for another attack, again targeting the headboats. The 3 subs, brightly illuminated by flares, were firing tightly and keeping the planes at bay. An impressive fireworks display erupted, engulfing both airplane and boats. Suddenly the Tommies flew away. Radar pulses showed them circling our formation, preparing another attack. I climbed above the bridge railing, trying to see or at least hear the flying planes. Euro 1.45. The target of the new British attack was a submarine following at the end of the formation astern of us. The 4-engine Liberator made an approach from the starboard side and, diving on the bow of U-256, tried to carpet bomb our formation from the rear. Bodenberg's anti-aircraft boat crews opened fire. However, the plane made a turn and left the zone of fire. Then came our chance. "Fire!" I commanded. 5 anti-aircraft guns, all we had, hit the Liberator as it dropped its bombs in front of the U-256, whizzing past us. 4 giant water columns soared into the sky, following the bullet-riddled airplane as it tried to escape our fire. However, our 37mm anti-aircraft gun did not miss. The plane exploded and fell into the water. U-256, damaged by the dropped bombs, lost the move and helplessly froze behind our stern, slowly falling out of the general formation. We saw her for the last time. Realizing that the failure of the U-256 made us a primary target in case of attack from the tail of the column, I ordered to bring more ammunition to the anti-aircraft guns. Impulses increased dramatically. However, for some time the British did not attack. 102.20. Now the impulses came from the starboard side. Suddenly, from the night darkness on the right, popped up Sunderland. "Plane on the starboard side, height 40 metres, fire!" I shouted. Short bursts from our twin 20mm guns followed. The pilot, however, skillfully steered the machine directly above us out of range of our fire and dropped 4 bombs. At the same time, we were attacked on bearing 90 from the starboard side of the Liberator, firing from all barrels. A moment later, 4 explosions went off near the middle of the boat. They lifted the U-415 out of the water and ploughed our sailors onto the deck plates. Then the boat sank back into the water, and tons of water raised by the explosions fell on it and broke through the hatchway. That was the end of it. Both diesels failed. The right horizontal rudder jammed. U-455 went in an arc, gradually losing speed. Above us, on the starboard side, hung a flare, traitorously highlighting the dead boat. She swayed helplessly on the waves. Fuel was leaking from her ruptured tank. U-455 had become an immobile target that could be easily destroyed. Confused, I looked through the hatchway into the dark space of the hull. It seemed as if all life had stopped there. Anxiety seized me. The boat could sink at any moment, so I commanded, "All hands on deck, get the lifeboats and laps ready." Not a sound was heard in reply. The occupants of the solid hull must have been stunned by the explosions. Endless seconds passed. In the distance the planes buzzed, preparing for another attack. It was to be fatal. Suddenly the submariners, awakened from shock, began to climb up the gangway. They were rushing for fresh air, throwing rubber lifebelts on the bridge. We began to prepare lifeboats. Meanwhile, anti-aircraft gunners were aiming their guns at invisible airplanes circling over helpless prey. The rapidity of the attack and the severe damage prevented us from sending a distress signal. This, I thought grimly, is the fate of many of my fallen friends, a silent and unspoken death. U-415 was awaiting the final blow. As the boat did not seem to be about to sink, I ordered the submariners to take shelter behind the deckhouse and stop lowering the lifeboats. I was determined to stay aboard as long as the boat kept afloat and to shoot back as long as ammunition remained and the gunners were able to fire the anti-aircraft guns. It turned out, however, that we were not destined to perish without warning. The radio operator managed to set up a radio transmitter and send a radiogram to headquarters about the disaster. 2-28, the increased roar of aircraft engines announced a new attack. Another Sunderland came in from the starboard side, firing furiously. As it passed over our bridge, it dropped a bomb cluster of 4 bombs. The deafening explosions threw the boat aside. We were attacked on the left by a Liberator. Our crews on twin 20mm anti-aircraft guns immediately opened fire on the cabin, quickly emptying the magazines. The Black Monster swept over the bridge, dropped 4 warheads, then sped away, blowing exhaust gases in our faces. As the sub was thrown to the left and 4 water columns rose high into the sky near the starboard mid-tanks, an anti-aircraft gunner with a 38mm automatic cannon put a series of live charges into the bomber's fuselage. Either plane, engulfed in flames, crashed into the sea. The roar of the Sunderland's engines died away. Then everything went silent. Near the boat, a small flame still glowed on the surface. U-415 was dying, but it was still afloat. Fly and Boog were out of action. We were left with no means of warning. The bridge was pierced by shells. A shell burst, killed an anti-aircraft gunner. Many were wounded. The XO moaned in pain. His back was badly cut by shrapnel. After the battle, I felt hot. Believing that I was sweating, I ran the back of my palm over my inflamed eyes. When it turned red, I realized blood was streaming down my face. The white cap was pierced by tiny shards like a sieve, some of them cutting into my head. Then I heard the voice of the chief engineer from below. "The boat is taking on water through the galley and bow valves. There's a bad leak in the radio room. I'll try to fix it if you can get the planes away." "Can you get her to submerge?" I asked. "I can't promise anything. We don't have power, but I'll do what I can." I walked down to the slippery deck. It was cracked in several places by the shells that hit the planks before bouncing into the water and bursting. One of the bomb containers hit the centre tank on the starboard side and left a deep dent in it. Worse, the aft starboard ballast tanks were ruptured. Fuel fluid out of them in a powerful jet, quickly spreading on the surface of the sea. With every minute, the danger of a new raid was growing. The submarine swayed weakly on the ocean waves, paralysed and almost dead. The next 20 or 30 minutes were to bring the finale. With our hearts beating, we expected either another attack or death in the depths of the sea. Suddenly the hoarse voice of the chief engineer sounded. "The boat is ready to dive to a limited depth, no more than 20 metres. The motor alone is capable of 80 revolutions. Can you keep her at that depth, or will the boat go down?" "I don't know, but I can try." I decided to take my chances. The submariners above quickly descended through the round hatch into their steel coffin. I watched as the deck gradually went under water, and I slammed the hatch cover shut. A few seconds later, the water engulfed the U-415. Inside, the hull looked as if a hurricane had blown through it. In the flicker of the emergency lights, I walked across a deck strewn with spigots, conduits, wires, broken glass, vents, bunks, and tables. Water whipped through holes in the radio room, valves in the bow and galley. Both rudder ballers were bent, and on the starboard side so badly that the rudder could not be turned. The forward set of batteries was cracked and the compartment filled with electrolyte. The radio room was smashed, the gyro compass was smashed, the depth gauge was disabled, the electric and diesel compressors were destroyed, both periscopes were broken, the starboard diesel was ripped off its base, and the main pump on the centrifuge was smashed. Since the mechanical controls for the vertical and horizontal rudders were jammed, I ordered them to be operated manually. Smooth, silent motion. Only the slight whirring of one electric motor and the muffled clanking of tools can be heard. Slowly, the soul and body released from the terrible tension. For several hours we moved forward, I managed the boat, and the chief engineer supervised the repair work. We moved almost blindly, relying only on an inaccurate magnetic compass, constantly ready for the boat to fall to the bottom. 10:27. Suddenly, at a depth of 27 metres, the boat experienced a powerful shock. It was followed by two more. We hit a reef off the coast of Brittany. The situation was critical because I couldn't get my bearings from the periscope. Right rudder. Blow out buoyancy tank 3. Course 270. Another jolt. One. Another. Then a piercing sound. The iron barrel jerked sharply and flew off 15 metres. Clanking sounds. 1, 2, 3. Then a monstrous scraping. The boat collided with the underwater obstacle once again. The force of the jolt almost threw her to the surface, where we would last only a few minutes. Then the U-415 slowly turned westward, and it seemed to me that we would be swept away from the dangerous reefs. 10:45. Glavmech got out of the deckhouse and reported that the periscope was fixed. I went over to him. When the periscope eyepieces showed the surface of the sea, I was amazed to see that we were surrounded by grey cliffs. On top of one of them, to the northeast, the Kesson lighthouse was flashing. As it turned out, we were caught in a current that was carrying us right onto the rocks. Having recovered from the shocking sight, I shouted, "Chief Engineer, what is the rotation speed of the portside Balla?" 120 RPE. Get it up to 150, or we're going to crash into the rocks. Through the periscope, I saw a squadron of airplanes flying at low altitude, then pointed it at the lighthouse to see how we were doing against the current. There was no progress. I shouted again, "Chief Mech, add another 50 revolutions." "It's dangerous. The electric motor could seize up," I heard back. "I don't care. Give me even 200 RPM. The boat should go faster." Soon, I felt a strong vibration. I caught the focus of my periscope on one of the dangerous rocks. The boat was already approaching it, but now it began to slowly crawl out of the trap. After 40 minutes, we rounded the outermost reef to the west, and I rubbed my sweaty neck with relief. When the tide began to ebb, I turned the boat on its former course to the south and ordered the Balla rotation to be reduced to a safe 100 revolutions. 13 BSOs. The XO relayed the alarming news that we would run out of power in less than 2 hours. If this is true, we must leave the boat immediately. However, I didn't want to abandon it. I hoped to reach the rendezvous point with our escort by a daring dash in a surface position. 13:30. The boat is moving at periscope depth. The sky is patrolled by airplanes in 4 to 6 units. No land is visible. 13:45. Movement continues. A squadron of twin-engine airplanes is passing a mile to the north of us, almost touching the surface of the sea. 13:58. 2 liberators appeared from the east. I put the periscope away and waited for them to move away. 14:10. Periscope, back above the surface. I made sure that we were approaching the rocks at the tip of Brest Bay and turned the periscope to check the situation. 3 twin-engine airplanes appeared from astern. I lowered the periscope as fast as the lifting device allowed. 2:18 p.m. The blue sky was clear of airplanes. It was our hour to make a dash to the meeting point with the escort and transmit a radiogram with a request for help. 14:20. The boat has surface-ed. When I went to the bridge, I almost blinded from the sunlight. The only diesel engine coughed, and the exhausted submarine began to slowly pick up speed. I nervously watched the sky, while the radio operator adjusted the transmitter to send a radiogram requesting air cover. Then followed endless minutes of being alone on the bridge. The boat waddled through the enemy-controlled area, leaving behind a thick plume of fuel. The sky inexplicably remained free of airplanes. A few minutes later, we reached the agreed-upon rendezvous point with the escorts. I turned the boat eastward to shorten the distance to shore. However, the gentle regime that allowed us to stay on the surface ended. 5 twin-engine airplanes appeared behind the stern from behind the horizon. We instantly went underwater. Disaster. The boat, deprived of power, went out of control, went down with trim on the bow and sank to the bottom at a depth of 42 metres after a powerful shock. A few seconds later, the bursts of depth charges rumbled. Water rushed into the boat, flooded the deck plates and filled the bottom. There was a danger of water filling the aft battery compartment. The water weighed down the U-415. If the enemy forces us to stay underwater for too long, we will no longer be able to rise from the bottom of the sea. 19:35. The water shorted out the electric drive to our only functioning pump. The chances of surfacing quickly diminished. The hull of the boat became as quiet as a tomb. All I could hear was water dripping from above. I pulled the green curtain at my bunk and began to think about how to get out of the situation. 23. Help from the base could come at any minute, if only our radio signal was picked up. I ordered the acoustic instruments to be turned on, but the acoustician heard only the noise of our own submarine. 01 Chewero. No signals from the east, where the port was and where help was to come from. I risked waiting another 2 hours and then tried to pass into the bay myself. 50. Straight ahead I hear a faint noise of propellers. The voice of the acoustician electrified me. I went to him, put on my headphones. The noise from the escorts grew fainter and soon became silent. I could physically feel the tons of water pressing down on our boat. Maybe the escorts had stopped, or had we transmitted inaccurate coordinates, or maybe they were attacked by airplanes and the ships returned to port. 23:07. Once again we heard a noise and began to gradually intensify. The sound of rotating propellers became distinguishable. It was necessary to act quickly, or the escorts would turn back without finding anyone. 23:08. Blow out all ballast. Compressed air rushed into the tanks, but U-415 remained stationary. 03:09. Stop blowing tanks 1 to 3, all aft. The boat still did not move. 03:10. Everybody in the forward compartment. Blow out all tanks, I commanded. 03:P. All aft. I continued to command, covered in cold sweat. 03:12. Everybody in the forward compartment. Hurry up, guys, hurry up. We're out of compressed air. 03:13. All aft again. The boat began to rock gently. She was lurching, trembling, but rose higher and higher, saving herself. At the very surface she shuddered for the last time, broke free, and stood perfectly still. I opened the hatch cover and jumped out into the darkness. 2 shadows were moving in front of us. I beeped my flashlight, alerting them that we were in a state of emergency and could only move at 5 knots. Immediately one of the escorts joined us in the keel. Thus, between the 2 ships, U4 Ferreis began her slow progress towards the harbour. 04:45. Manoeuvring with difficulty on 1 diesel, I steered the boat into a lighted square in the concrete shelter, where several dark figures were waiting for us on the pier. The bow recoiled, jabbing into the concrete wall, but the moorings, already secured to the bollards, held the boat in place. A minute later the gangways were thrown over. Captain Winter rushed aboard the boat and shook my hand firmly. He was obviously touched. "It's good to see you and the crew. You ought to wash and clean yourself up. You look like a pirate. Send the boys to their rooms and let them rest. I'll see you as soon as you're ready to rendezvous." He turned to my submariners, saluted, and then returned to the pier. When I got out of the boat, I saw Zase and Bodenberg, who had returned to port the previous night. Their boats had been towed to Brest by escorts following the destroyers before our column was attacked by enemy planes. I dragged myself up the hill and out to my room, thanking my lucky star profusely. It seemed to me that U4 Fortuyn had made her last trip. She was so mangled that it was hard to hope to get her back in service. Now the command would have to provide me with a new boat equipped with a schnurkel. Comforted by this, I took a shower, washed off the blood and sweat, wrapped myself in white sheets and fell into a deep sleep. At noon I was awakened by a sharp pain. My head was aching from the wounds inflicted by the shrapnel. The pain pierced my whole body in the rhythm of my heartbeat. The bright sun was blinding my eyes. After finishing the agonizing process of getting dressed, I struggled to reach the hospital, located 2 buildings away from our housing unit. The young doctor examined my wounds and said, "I will have to shave your head." I objected, and the doctor agreed to shave only certain areas on my head. He froze my scalp, then picked, cut, and stapled the skin for almost an hour before letting me go. After recovering from the pain, I visited the wounded XO and gunnery officer. Both were well looked after. They recovered quickly and asked me not to look for replacements for them. I soon found out that the Allied invasion of Normandy was continuing. American landings on the beaches of the Cotentin Peninsula and British landings near Bayeux could still be dropped at sea. Our defensive lines suffered serious losses, but were not broken through. Meanwhile, the pitiful remnants of the German submarine fleet received another crushing blow. In the month preceding the 6 days of June, 25 of our submarines were sunk. The total number of losses rose to the incredible figure of 440 vessels. We had only 60 subs left to repel the landing. Most of them were based in ports along the coast of Norway and the Bay of Biscay. Participated in operations against the Allied landing only 15 submarines that came out of Brest. Of the 8 sent to suicide without schnurkels, 5 were lost forever. The 3 rescued, U450, U413 and U256, only accidentally escaped death. As a result of the heavy losses, the command cancelled the insane order to move in a surface position and ram the enemy ships. Thanks to this was delayed the final defeat of the German submarine fleet. As for the 7 submarines equipped with Schnurkel, which together with us left Brest Bay on June 6th, their fate was still unknown. 5 other boats with Schnurkels were sent to the Channel from the Atlantic to compensate for our losses, but only 2 arrived there. Thus we lost at least 12 subs in the first phase of the Allied invasion. U415 was placed in dry dock. Virtually everything in her needed strengthening and replacement, from a badly deformed hull to 2 deteriorated rudder ballers. Glavme identified about 500 serious breakdowns, but this list was reduced to 55 due to lack of spare parts and time. Each boat was sent to sea as soon as possible, even if it was not quite combat-worthy. U4 with all her troubles, had to be repaired somehow in 2 weeks. While the repair work was going on, I continued to demand the installation of a schnurkel on my submarine, but all demands were constantly rejected on the pretext that our equipment trains could not reach Brest because of sabotage by French underground fighters. In desperation, I tried to hire a truck to go for the Schnöckel myself, but I was not allowed to take the risk of a transcontinental trip. The shortage in the most common equipment and spare parts was so great that the U-256 had to be taken apart to re-equip the U-413 and U-415. Bodenberg, commander of U-265, and his crew were sent home for new assignments. With Bodenberg's departure, Zarsi and I were left as the last submarine captains in Brest. We realized that the people who gave us orders had lost their sense of reality and even common sense. But we were taught to follow orders, reasonable and not so reasonable, and so we were doomed to perish along with U-450 and U-43. We never made our secret thoughts public, never mentioned in conversation with each other the possibility of inevitable and senseless death, but tried to concentrate on our duties, listening with increasing alarm to the news from Normandy, including official reports from the Wehrmacht High Command and more accurate accounts from the battlefields north of us. During the second and third weeks of the invasion, Anglo-American troops gradually gained a foothold on the Kootenay Peninsula, then broke through our front in two sections and began an offensive westward. However, new German divisions were thrown onto the front, and we still hoped that it would be held. At the same time, the situation of our submarine forces continued to deteriorate. U-247 with Schnöckel was severely damaged by destroyer bombardment and had to return to port before reaching the English Channel. U-269, another Schnöckel submarine under Uhl's command, was sunk near the south coast of England. 5 submarines equipped with these devices, coming finally out of Norwegian ports, were sunk one after another at short intervals. By June 30th, our U-boat operations, which had begun during the Allied invasion, had ended in total failure. We had sunk only 5 Allied transports and 2 destroyers, and had lost 22 subs. In the last days of June, the command gave me an unpleasant surprise. 3 young, inexperienced officers arrived aboard the submarine to replace our veterans. The newcomers were to go with use on their first and, most likely, fateful voyage. The crew met them with undisguised skepticism. The departure of experienced officers created a vacuum in boat management, which could be filled by me alone. On June 30th, U-415 had already been declared fit for a new campaign. On the eve of going to sea, I received a letter from home. It informed me that my parents and sister had moved to Darmstadt, the capital of Hesse. Trudy was expecting a baby in the fall. I was delighted by the news, but saddened by my father's decision to move again to a city where the family would be under constant threat of air raids. That's what I wrote in my return letter home. I did not write to my family about how close death was walking around me, ending my message with a cheerful goodbye. In my situation, that wish was like black humour.